Okay, the fifth and final force that I want to discuss with you is the threat of new entry. Like rivalry, the threat of new entry deals with how the pie is going to be carved up. In other words, we know that in order to have an attractive industry, you have to both create value and be able to capture some of the value as incumbents that are in the business. And the threat of new entry really addresses this issue of whether or not the dissipation of profits between incumbents in the business is affected by this threat that an outsider is going to come into the business. Now, Porter, in his article, focuses on what constitutes barriers to entry. He asks this question, what does it cost to get into the business? And there's a number of factors here that are emphasized that could create these barriers to entry. Here's a list. First on the list is you have to be big. You have to have economies of scale. In other words, if you enter at a very low level, you can't be competitive. You have to be big to amortize your costs over a pretty big volume of units that you're selling. If you have to be big, then it's going to be you're going to be deterred from entry because you're going to think, okay, I'm not sure that I'm going to be successful at the outset. It's going to be difficult for me to commit to being so large right from the beginning. If you have to be differentiated and find a niche, that's going to make it difficult to enter and may be deterring. If you got to build a brand, if you have to overcome switching costs because let's say the buyers and suppliers in the business are happy with what they have, they may not want to switch. That may be a deterrent to entry. If you've got to raise a lot of capital and you can't collateralize that easily, that's going to be a deterrent to entry. If you've got to get access to dealers or distributors or get access to a supply chain upstream, that may make it difficult to get in. And if you have to get a license or some sort of regulatory approval through government policy, that's going to make it difficult to get in as well. Now, one of the paradoxes of the threat of entry is that we've learned over the past 20 years or so that entry occurs in most industries all of the time. We have entry in high barrier industries such as pharmaceuticals, because companies that are outside they may look at a big barrier to entry in pharma, such as created by the odds of coming up with a new drug, and then you got to overcome marketing challenges, and then you've got to get FDA approval and so on. All of those barriers to entry may be significant, but if you're successful, the rewards are so great that many biotech companies are trying to enter the pharmaceutical industry, even despite the height of those barriers. So we see incidences of entry in high barrier industries because of the potential for returns. In low barrier industries, as Porter explains, like let's say the taxi cab industry here in Toronto, it's not that hard to enter that industry. We don't see very many organizations or individuals entering that business because the returns are just so darn low. What's the point of trying to bid for a taxi license and to get qualified to be a taxi driver in Toronto if you can't make any money at it? Even though the barriers to entry are low, it's not worth it to try to get into the business. So we've learned that the challenge of understanding the threat of entry actually goes beyond just assessing what the barriers to entry are. And Porter does foreshadow this and have a line or two about this in the article that you read here. I just want to expand on that in my remarks here. We really look at three questions now when we understand the threat of entry. And these three questions relate to the core task here of trying to understand why the industry's profits are high. Imagine that we're looking at an industry like beer where there's that 7% increment to ROA that's associated with with incumbency. So, Anheuser-Busch, Coors, Miller, SAB, and so on are earning that 7% above the 4% economic average here. We're asking this question here, why is the threat of entry low? What is it that's keeping those entrants that might be interested in making beer, like these microbreweries that are cropping up all over the place? Why aren't they threatening the incumbents of those entrants? That's the question we want to ask. We're trying to explain why profits are high by asking the question, why is the threat of entry low? Why aren't those entrants dissipating profits? So it turns out we have to address three related questions that are separate nonetheless. The first is, what are the barriers? What does it take to get in the first place? The second is, are the costs and risks low enough compared to the benefits that occur if you're successful to invite experimental entry? Are biotech firms compelled to try because even though the costs and risks are high, the returns are so much higher that it's still worth it. And then finally, if entrants are successful against this backdrop that most entry fails, most entrants are entrepreneurial organizations that are not going to be successful. But let's say we do have a successful one. Does that new entrant actually grow the business, or does it damage the profitability of the incumbents? See, in biotech, most companies that are successful on the model that I've just described are actually inventing new drugs that don't exist. And so what they're doing is they may be growing the market. Even if they're not growing the market and putting in a new drug for a condition that already exists, they need access to critical capabilities that the established pharmaceutical companies have. Like, for example, the ability to call on doctors and explain what the drug does and introduce it to the market. So what they'll do is they'll license that drug to large rivals after they're successful in order to be able to market the drug or even get it through the final stages of an FDA approval process. So they're actually growing the market and making the incumbents more profitable, not less profitable. We see that in the motorcycle industry as well. You know, you can think of those TV shows that feature the manufacturer of, on a small scale, of specialty motorcycles, such as Orange County Choppers and West Coast Choppers. You know, they make 50 or 100 motorcycles a year. They're very high end. The presence of these television shows actually helps Harley Davidson, Ducati, and so on, Honda, Suzuki, Yamaha, as motorcycle manufacturers. The successful entry of these television shows that feature the building out of motorcycles is actually, it grows the market. It publicizes the fun of motorcycle riding, you know, and actually makes the incumbents more successful, not less successful. So the answer to that last question is that the threat of success doesn't damage the profitability of the incumbents. Instead, it grows the market, so the threat of entry is low. We're interested here in whether the profits that are being split up among the incumbents in the business are being threatened by entry. Let me give you one other example on the other side of that before I finish up on this particular force among the five. And that's a situation where there's actually no entry, but the threat of entry actually is damaging the profitability of the incumbents, and that's in the airline business. You know, it may be that when a new airport is being built, that a committed airline will buy up all the gates that it can, buy up access to all the gates that it can in that airport, even though it doesn't intend to use them initially, because it doesn't want any other airline to be a proximate competitor at that airport. It doesn't want another airline to have a way to get into that airport. So it may overcommit to gates in an effort to try to protect a market position. There's a situation where the threat of entry is actually compelling the incumbent to actually incur expenses in order to try to protect itself against the potential from entry, even though entry isn't occurring. So it's very interesting. Here we're looking again from the perspective, what's driving that 7% bar for the beer industry, for example, or for any industry that you're looking at that's attractive. What is it that is driving the threat that's created by the potential of entry what's driving that to be low? And in unattractive industries like airlines, is there anything going on with regard to the threat of entry that's depleting the profits of the incumbents, whether that entry occurs or not?